Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. So, on today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the wounding and healing of men. And I feel like this is a very, very important topic because when we talk about masculinity, when we talk about issues centered around men, we talk about the same kinds of things, but we don't often look at the circumstances that have created the coping behavior within men and aspects of what would need to change in order to create a wider ripple effect within communities, within relationships, within the mental health space, and to provide accurate to provide effective support for men going forward. I've been doing a lot of reading on this recently. I've been reflecting on my own stuff as a man, being a part of an accountability group with other men has been very eye-opening as well. Seeing the same themes come up, seeing the same issues, problems, struggles, backgrounds, wounding, and just looking at the ripple effect it has on relationships, families, and the wider community. And I think in the West, one of the most important things to identify is that we don't have what's considered traditional rites of passage marking the transition from boyhood onto manhood, the way we do in the Eastern, I suppose the rest of the world or other cultures and civilizations. But this would have been something that was much more commonplace in older civilizations because they knew the importance of having initiated men. Society is weak when we do not have mature, responsible, service-led men, initiated men who are aware of their masculinity and the responsibilities that comes with that. So the passage from boyhood and the manhood is what marks, that spiritual and significant shift where they leave behind the freedom of childhood, of adolescence, and step into the responsibility of adulthood. And now, this has been really significant in the West, I suppose, since like the Industrial Revolution onwards. Men would have been out working. A lot of the older professions where they were centered around the family, that would have began to change. The male role then would have become more about providing for the family. So that actual relationship between a boy and his father would have shifted dramatically from that point in time. And when we think about it in terms of the transfer of wisdom, the transfer of knowledge, even religious, cultural, and societal expectations became less and less. And again, also because this became the done thing, the expected thing, all that psychological wounding, all that unintegrated trauma, all that familial expectations and conditioning would have passed generation to generation to generation. And that would have went forward. Now, when we talk about rites of passage and what that's supposed to encompass, we can break it down into a couple of steps. So we can talk about the severance piece, being taken away from your community, your support network, your family. Often be older males or what would have been historically elders in the community. The severance also is symbolic of the old way of being cut off to birth the new. So the new role, the new responsibility, and letting go of the old way of life. So for men, it is about leaving boyhood behind, leaving those childhood behaviors and ways of being in the past. Then there was the symbolism around what is known as the threshold. So a challenge which brings forth the inner resources within the male, the person. So in some cultures, this could have been symbolic wounding. I've seen this even in some of the reading where, in some parts of the world, men were even had meat hooks placed in their pecs, lifted up into there, suspended, by hooks, actually being physically wounded. Parts of limbs might be cut off. I suppose the closest thing we can talk to within that, I suppose in the West, would be even like male circumcision and stuff, but it's not really as, I suppose, pronounced as what it would have been in some other cultures around the world. But also some of this consent around ego death, stretching the person to beyond themselves, to what they didn't think was possible, because the whole point of that is to activate resources within them, to put them in touch with their own inner strength, their own masculinity, to be able to teach them to trust themselves. And then the final stage of this would have been reintegration, coming back into the community, being celebrated, witnessed, taking on a new role, new purpose, responsibility, and stepping into that going forward. That might be the transfer of knowledge, the relationship to their faith, the gods, whatever it is, but embodying that role, responsibility, and the expectations of the community. And when we think of a society full of immature, weak men that are doubting their ability, doubting their masculinity, they're uninitiated, not tested, unable to embody what masculinity is because they have no template of it. They haven't been tested, they haven't been initiated, they haven't had that experience from a group of older men that have initiated them, who they themselves were initiated. Then in a lot of ways they're without purpose, they're without meaning, without direction in life, and the wounding that men will have will not be transformative as such, and they're not in service in the world as the same extent. They're more self-led as opposed to service-led. So there's a lot of big sound bites within that, and I think like purpose and meaning for men is, it's paramount. It's one of those things about having direction, having something to work towards, being bigger than the self, having meaning, having actual meaning to your existence. And I think like when we talk about the differences between male and female within the scope of gender roles, men are very much restricted, whether we like it or not, by gender roles in a different way than the way women are in some regards. Men have to fall into that category of expectation that they will protect, they will provide, they will procreate, they will defend their family, country, faith. They'll provide. That'll center around going to work, being available for war, and carrying the burden of worry. The expectation to provide, even at the detriment of the self, even at the detriment of your relationships, because that is the male expectation. And if you think about it, when some men lose the ability to work, they lose their whole self-concept, they lose their whole identity, because they have been conditioned to associate their utility, their sense of purpose, their sense of worth and value as a human being by the ability to provide. And that can happen when we see people retire. The mortality rates shoot up because they associate the sense of self with the work on some level. Now, and if you think about it, if somebody consciously chooses not to work and they're male, they get shamed because it goes against even some of the unconscious conditioning we have around a man's value being centered around work, being seen as inadequate, lazy, shunned, or irresponsible. But men need purpose. They need a deep sense of purpose. And I think even within the element of the soul, something about the expectation of being a man is that it's not about what you want for this lifetime in terms of like your contribution, but it is what is necessary to be a provider for your family, for your partner, whatever is expected of you, that will come before your own creativity, your own hopes, your own dreams on some level. And that is one of those gendered expectations. If you think back even 2-3 generations for some of the people that are listening like to this, and think about like your grandparents or your great grandparents, and think about like the males and those family roles potentially. Now, they may or may not have been good role models, but they might not have thought so much about what they wanted to be or how they wanted life to look. It was more a case of what was expected. They put food on the table to get people through. They could have been doing work that they didn't like, that they actively hated, because that was the done thing. That was living up to the expectations, being responsible, being a provider, and doing what they needed to do. But that is not about meaning. It's not about purpose, and it's not about wholeness and integration. So it's an interesting one. As I said, protect, procreate, provide. Those are some of the elements that center around men. Then we think about work and war. You're expected to work. If you can't work, you're not of use because you're not a provider. You can't therefore provide for your family. You can't contribute to society. And then with war, it's that idea of, men are the protectors. So when war happens, it's men that are conscripted first and foremost. When something happens to the family, the male is supposed to step up and protect. And that's the conditioning and the gender roles that we talk about as it applies to men. Now, within that, one of the psychological differences that come up around this is, and I touched on this briefly in the last podcast, but men are very much not driven, but fear takes up a lot of place in the psyche of men. There's a lot of worry around how they're going to be seen. The idea of being connected to their feminine or being in touch with certain emotions, there's that fear that it will make them weak, that they'll be shamed by other people. As I mentioned, even their own relationship with other men, they don't see men the same way that sometimes females will have that companionship, have that understanding of being able to share and bond through social bonds. which helps them immensely in times of stress. Men will see other men potentially more as enemies or as competition or as a potential threat than they will as, say, potential brothers, somebody that can help them, that can support them, that can, call them forward. And I give the example of Hector from Troy because it was one of those classical examples. He was more okay with the idea of being wounded in battle by the Greeks than being seen to be afraid in front of his comrades, because it would be the ultimate shame for him, to be seen weak, to be seen as cowardly, to be seen as less than. Physical pain and actually dying in those contexts were seen as preferable to being afraid, to be upset. It's that unconscious belief, well, that I shouldn't be afraid, and if I am afraid, there must be something wrong. But really, boys grow up knowing the world is dangerous, the world's not safe. You can't really trust people, and you need to be strong. You need to look a certain way, and the thing is, or perform a certain way, or be a certain way, and that feeds into these ideas of what masculinity is. And I think it was Jung says, when we're wounded, it quickens your consciousness, and that gives some of the impetus for growth. And I think like a lot of men will go through many forms of wounding in life. You'll be guaranteed you'll be wounded in some capacity in your life, but wounding without a form of transformation is just wounding. And this is where the rites of passage take on that spiritual significance and that meaning and that purpose, because you're wounded in a way that is pulling forward and calling forward inner resources. It's transformative. It teaches you so much more about yourself. It gives you that inner trust, that inner resilience. It lets you be in touch with the actual tangible aspect of your masculinity and your manhood. And you're stepping into something bigger than yourself, being of service, being connected to something. And when that's absent, and we see this time and time again, we have got adult boys that have no grasp of what their actual masculinity is, and then they're looking for it outside of the self, whether it's in achievements and women and status and cars and resources. And it's not their fault in a modern context in a way, because it's a constantly shifting landscape. And the thing is, they never inherited a template potentially from a present father who was initiated, who had that healthy masculinity template. And I can't generalize and speak for everybody, but when we're talking about it as a problem, that is one of the elements that is quite noticeable. I thought this was really interesting as well. The amount of space in the male psyche that the feminine takes up is quite substantial, and a lot of information that men get very early in life about who they are and their place in the world will be from females. It'll be their mothers, it'll be their early teachers, their early caretakers. It'll be those early forms of attunement that will be very significant, as it is for females as well. But a man's relationship with his mother will also form a large imprint on how he perceives the feminine, how he perceives his own feminine, how he perceives his relationship to women when he gets older. And there will be elements of that in his unconscious that he will project forward. There will be elements of transference there. That can lead to all sorts of unhealthy behaviors, like trying to intimidate, trying to control, trying to coerce, trying to placate, appease, avoid confrontation. And a lot of that is connected to those early relationships with their own mother, and that in some ways that disconnection and disavow of their own feminine is where we can see that anger, that displaced frustration even put on towards where they see the feminine others. So that could be with like men that are gay or homosexual or whatever, and people being very angry and outspoken and projecting a lot of that stuff. That's their stuff, but it's also because they're completely disconnected from any element of their own feminine. They're trying to distance themselves in every single way from what is feminine within themselves, and it's just further and further self-alienating. And this is also why sex can feel quite mechanical with people that have this as well, because it's not rooted in connection. It's just a temporary relief for them. It's a numbing behavior, but it's I don't even know how I got that. It's like an element of them trying to find some sort of sense of acceptance within the self. So just on that, like I didn't think I was going to dive into the whole concept about the mother complex, but the reason, coming back to this about why the rites of passage are so important, especially having elder males, when you think about that template of seeing yourself in an older man, it gives you something to emulate. It gives you somebody who also holds you accountable, who calls you forward, who checks your ego, who can model a way of being. And if we think about the safety and the nurturance and the emotional attunement that comes with a present attuned Muller, we are also looking at the element of the initiation, the passage, as a form of discipline and a form of love being imposed from the elders and the fathers or whatever males is connected to that. Because what it does is that transition, moving them from boyhood to manhood, is also severing that dependence, that psychological dependence on the mother. And that in the past would have broken that psychological dependence on the mother complex. And I think that's also something nowadays that's not present. You know, we've got a lot of men who also seek those roles out in their partners. They have, you know, partners that they become mentally, emotionally, physically, and financially dependent upon. You know, they put that partner in a parental role or a caretaking role rather than they themselves being in the masculine and leading in those contexts. One of the big things within the wounded in men is also, you know, what we've spoken about before, that idea that it's not safe to communicate your feelings because men are guaranteed wounding, especially the older men. It's going to happen in life. You know, one of the only socially acceptable places where it can be seen to show emotions at times for men is sports. You know, you'll see it at football, you'll see it at all sorts of sporting events. You'll see people upset, you'll see people crying tears of joy, you'll see people hurt, actively showing themselves when they've been injured, being hurt. But when it's done from a place of striving for something or in competition, it's contained in those spaces. But the thing is, if men are vulnerable and they do it in the wrong place, especially young when they're growing up, every man can remember a time where he shared something, maybe from an open, honest, or vulnerable place, and he was humiliated, rejected, shamed, put down, you know, seen to be fragile or weak or feminine. And this is the thing, they don't want that. They need to be distanced from that. They don't want to be put down by other men. And that's the thing. That is one of the major expectations of men from men, is that we don't share our emotions in that way. We don't pull that up in the self. We don't pull it up on other people. And that is a major difference between men and women, because we can see this with bonding behavior with women. They'll openly talk about relationship issues, thoughts, feelings, different things. They can support each other in that way. But this isn't the case with men. Now, that won't always be the case, you know. And I think, like, when somebody decides they work on themselves, they open up, they do the work, they have that strength of self to be able to talk about their feelings. It's nuanced. And I think, like, when people can be honest with themselves, they can hold space for other people to be honest with themselves. And I think I read somewhere, and I wrote it down in these notes, the person who speaks the right words will be heard 1,000 miles away. And this is the thing about self-deception. Men need to stop lying about their own pain. You know, they need to allow the world to see them for who they are, and they need to stop feeding into this expectation of silent suffering. You know, it's about owning your emotions. It's about owning, you know, I suppose definitely within adulthood, the things that you've been through, breaking that cycle, so it's not modeled and it's carried forward another generation. It's about recognizing the impact that that has, because we need to be able to be in tune with our own emotional landscape. That's not to say we need to start showing up in a feminine way and we need to be consumed by our emotions, but we need to have the capacity to be with these emotions. We need to be emotionally intelligent, emotionally present. We need to be able to communicate in a way where we can let somebody into the inner world and have the sense of self and confidence and strength and resilience to be able to do that, and not be and living in terror and fear and shame of being judged by it. I spoke about the Muller complex earlier. In order to transcend it, men need to be wounded. So I spoke about ritual circumcision. That's one of the examples, even, I suppose, from a religious perspective. There was one other thing I remember reading about, somebody having the top of their finger cut off, and I can't remember where I read that before. As a rite of passage, you know, there can actually be physical wounding, as I mentioned there about the meat hooks and stuff, but it's not about just inflicting pain for the sake of inflicting pain. It was about the symbolic wounding to be able to show that this person is now transitioned. You know, they've moved from boyhood to adulthood. That comes with responsibility, and as such, we have the collective expectation to now treat them different, expect more from them. So as I said, there can be physical wounding, but it's also part of that resilience that comes with the threshold of the task. You know, so I think in some Native American cultures, well, they would have done, you know, fasts for maybe 3 or 4 days, vision quests, and then they would have, you know, been near the brink of death, and then went on these sweat lodges, and that would help them to find their purpose. You know, it would bring them so close to their actual breaking point and then they would be reintegrated back into society. One of the important things to remember about the psyches of men and the wounding of men is that some men have become violent because they themselves have been violated. They've had massive things happen to them over the course of their life that they weren't able to process and deal with. They have a mountain of anger, a mountain of emotion that's untapped, and no permission for them to be with those feelings socially, no outlet for them. And what happens in those scenarios is anger can be turned inwards or it can be turned outwards. So the anger turned inwards can lead to depression, it can lead to numbing behavior, it can lead to dissociation, low self-image, all those other behaviors. Anger turned outward, can become lashing out, becoming abusive, becoming controlling. And it's deep-rooted pain. We're talking about pain. And this is the thing. Without something significant, wounding is just wounding. Spiritual wounding and that rite of initiation and passage and meaning can be transformative, but people need an impetus to heal. People need a reason to get their shit together. And I think for men, if they just learn to cope by just burying down how they feel and just acknowledging, that there's no reason for them to change anything that they're doing, that cycle will just keep going and going and going. And I hate that saying, hurt people, but we all have choices, we all have personal responsibility. But that if somebody has that deep-rooted conditioning around not being able to be with their anger, not being able to be with what's beneath the anger, the hurt, the fear, the disappointment, the sadness, the frustration, not to have that validated by another group of men, not to have that witness, not to have that integrated, it will spill out in other more damaging, destructive ways, and their partners and their kids and their relationships with their family. They can become tyrannical in certain scenarios. The power can go to their head. And the thing is, suffering in silence in that way and carrying all them things, it's like, I can't remember where I read that thing about the Buddhist on the boat, and it was like the Buddhist's out in the boat in the water, and he's in meditation, and all of a sudden another boat bangs on the back of him, and he loses the plot, and he gets really angry, and he turns around, and he just realizes it's an empty boat. And then he has that moment of enlightenment. It wasn't the boat that made him angry, it had all that anger that was within him anyway. And it just took that vehicle of the boat to nudge it for that to come forward. And I think, from that lens with men, if men have had such violent backgrounds, if they've had all this wounding and they haven't been able to deal with it in an acceptable or safe way, then there's that likelihood that they will start to displace this. They will start to learn to cope in another way, and they themselves may become tyrannical as a result of that. They may become abusive, they may become violent. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes, through their own suffering, they end up inflicting more pain on others, or they might turn it inwards from a place of powerlessness and helplessness and become depressed and inflict harm on the self. And we see this with the mental health route. We see that we have an epidemic of suicide, and we can't really get through to some of these younger people, or not even younger people, even we're talking 16 to 40, 16 to 45, for male suicide. And it's an epidemic. It's something that is slightly inadequate in terms of how people are being helped. And I think one of the major barriers to this, and I've been saying this for such a long time, is I think men need to be there for other men, especially in the therapy spaces, because it's about feeling seen, understood, and supported as a man, by a man. And I think when you look at it through the cultural lens of the lack of initiation, the lack of the rite of passage, and we look at what men represent in society, men have no more strong archetypes to look up to. There was one of the examples I remember reading, and it was talking about, what was it they were talking about? The Odyssey, the battle of Greece against Troy, and they were talking about this archer. And as he was going on the boat towards Troy, he got bit by a snake, and his foot started to become really smelly and poisonous and all the rest. And it was rancid, and it was turning all the other boys in the boat, turning their stomach. So they fucked them off on an island and left them on this island. And what they didn't know was that this archer had some sort of connection to Hercules. He had some fucking phenomenal bow, and he could hit anybody with them and poison them and kill them. So they went on ahead. The Greeks went on ahead to the war, and they were losing the war. And then they realized they needed to go and get this bow anyway. Some oracle had told them they needed this bow. So they come back in the fucking boat, and lo and behold, your man's still alive in this island years later. And what they spoke about in that moment was, when the Greeks came, they were like, we need you, we need your bow. You need to come back and help us win this war. And your man says no, because he was wounded. He was angry. He was in that kind of narcissism around his own pain and his own stuff, and how he was ever going to move past this in this cave of isolation and pain. And he had a vision about, or like a dream of Hercules being like, come on, you can be the hero, you can win this fucking war. That was the hero complex. You can be something bigger than yourself, of service. And so he agreed to come on the boat, and that calling forth the best in him. He went on the boat, and they went back to Troy, and he fucked a few people up with this boat and turned or boat bow and arrow, fucked a few people up with a bow and arrow, and turned the tide for the Greeks. And that story of what they talked about was about that archetypal image of the champion, something within the self that they could aspire to be. And when we talk about men and we talk about the templates that men have, if they didn't have great relationships with their father, that is one of the big things that needs to be healed. And I think if you look at your own family, you look at your own relationship with your father, and then park any judgments that you have on it, and then think, what was his relationship like with his father? What was his family life like? What was the grandfather's existence like? What was it like for the family that he came out of? What pain was in that father? Was your grandfather present? Was he emotionally available? Was he a disciplinarian? Was he a tyrant? Was he abusive? What kind of relationship did they have? Did they have any relationship? Did they have to work all the time? And it's not about blaming, but it's about looking at it from the perspective of that damage and the wounding that would be caused, and what was lacking, what was there that your father didn't have, or your grandfather, even if you go back another level. Because man to man, we need to have that transmission of knowledge, that transmission of expectation, even the deep yearning for a connection with that part of the self, because you have a part of your father and a part of your mother within you, and it's grieving that. So some men have never actually consciously grieved what they didn't have. And again, it's think about your own father. Your own father might never have grieved his own relationship or lack of relationship with his father. And this isn't across the board. It's not generalized across the board. But a lot of men didn't get what they needed from their father, and it's not through a judgment on the father. It's just the gender roles, the expectations, maybe elements of trauma, unintegrated trauma, things that were going on, and that impacts the sense of self, because they can't talk about it, they can't communicate it, because they're not in touch with their own emotions, they're not in touch with their own ability to navigate this, to regulate the nervous system, to be able to understand that this is a significant thing that is lacking within them. But on a psycho-spiritual level, they know something is not right. And this is what tips the connection in favor of mothers and the dependence on their mothers. And it is not appropriate, nor should it be expected, for a mother to initiate a son or a boy, and that dependence that we spoke about earlier on doesn't really get severed, and then that's carried forward then into their adult intimate relationships, because the father is not there to break the dependence on the mother, to go through that ritual wounding, to go through that stage of initiation where that dependence is severed. And that doesn't happen, and it hasn't happened in the modern society. And that's what we find then with men is compensatory behavior. How many women can you shag? What kind of women are you going out with? Are you going to be the most beautiful girl? How much money you making? What kind of car do you drive? What kind of holidays do you have? How much money do you earn? All this bullshit. How many fights can you have? What reputation have you? You a tough guy? Do you look like a tough guy? All this compensatory behavior, because they're not in touch with their own deep-rooted masculinity, because they haven't been tested, they haven't been initiated, and they know that deep within them on some level. And that creates doubt. It creates doubt in their ability to know themselves, really fucking know themselves, and know what they're capable of. Because the man that is initiated, the man that knows what he's made of and has been through those things, like that word unapologetic triggers some people, but he doesn't need to compensate in those ways. He doesn't need to be aggressive with people for the sake of being aggressive. He doesn't need to bully or manipulate or demean or be tyrannical. He doesn't have to measure himself by those things, because his own inherent self-worth he is aware of, because he has those resources and resilience within him, because he has been through those rites of passage. And that's the thing, like when we think about, when people are like, oh, well, how is this going to change? We have so many absent fathers, and we have so many broken families and things like that. Well, the thing is, we are suffering a loss of elders within the community. We've massive cities. We don't have those small communities as such as like they would have had in older civilizations. But those roles were fucking significant for a reason. The elders, men, are crying out for those relationships with smarter, smarter maybe sounds wrong, more what we would consider wise elders that can hold that space, that they can turn to, that they can talk to, that they can learn from, that they can model and emulate, and that passes that wisdom, that passes that guidance, that gives them that companionship, that gives them that source of trust and motivation and direction and discipline that calls, and I'm saying this over and over again, that calls forward the best in them for something bigger than themselves. So going back to that narrative I said there about the war, it took that fucking dream about Hercules for that Greek to get his head out of his ass and stop feeling sorry for himself. And he's like, we can win this fucking war if you man up, if you fucking take life by the balls in this scenario and get over your own pain, get over your own wounding, get over what they've done on you, and you come back, we can win this, and this is something bigger than yourself. And I think this is something where people have lost sight of, men have lost sight of, as being in service, in life, not being self-led. And I read this quote and I wrote it down: no society can prosper if its men are immature. And I think that is so bang on. And when we talk about having a society of adult boys, this Peter Pan syndrome, never wanting to grow up and living like a teenager your whole life and not taking responsibility. Responsibility is good for you. Responsibility gives you purpose, meaning, direction, structure, and all those. It doesn't discount all those other things that I've mentioned, but men have to decide to choose to heal, to break those patterns going forward. They look at their conditioning, they look at the ways in which they're repeating unconscious patterns, causing more wounding, causing their own suffering, looking at the expectations and standards that they have inherited and have applied to the self, and how that is maybe showing up in destructive ways within their life, getting help to break cycles of addiction, trauma, abuse, all those different things that have held them back in their life. They intimately get to know themselves and they know what they're capable of. And they decide to do this because it's important, because we need men. We need men in society. We need men in our communities. We need men in our families. We need men in relationships. And we need strong, safe, actual fucking safe examples of what genuine masculinity is. And all that we really have nowadays is caricatures of this. Caricatures. It's nonsense. Alpha this and alpha that. That is not what a fucking the traditional element of what we would have seen of masculinity when we talk about the Stoics, or like Marcus Aurelius, or we talk about the Greeks. We talk about different civilizations, examples of it. They had very tangible examples of what they were striving towards: being disciplined, being of service, being a good human being, being like having a role in society where you're taking care of people, you're providing, you're protecting, you're still doing elements of those expectations, but you yourself aren't doubting that aspect of your masculinity because you've been initiated, because you have purpose and meaning bigger than the self. And I think that's really what I was trying to get at there. Being transformed through the process, being seen and knowing yourself and your masculinity and then your manhood. And that's the thing. Passages indicate an ending, a metaphorical death, and within that something new is born. But that comes through the initiation, that comes through the threshold, that comes through the challenge. And this is the thing, we need this. Elders knew this before, communities in the past knew this before, and that's what made their men comfortable in their identity, comfortable in their responsibilities, comfortable in their roles in society and within their families and within their relationships. I'm not saying this is all the fucking be all and end all of what men need, but it's a big part of it. Because otherwise we're seeing these examples of men numbing themselves, men not being able to regulate their emotions, men not being able to take the lead, men not being so disconnected from their masculine that they're embodying feminine behaviors, women taking on masculine roles within the relationship, feeling they need to. And again, that element of the mother complex comes into that. Hiding behind your job, hiding behind your career, your money, your wealth, your status, your this macho bravo fucking behavior that you're putting out, and beneath that there's maybe a fucking scared wee boy that's worried that he's going to be found out, that he's not everything that he makes himself out to be. And that's the thing, that is what these initiations are powerful for within the psyche, because every man has been shamed, every man has been humiliated, every man has had failures and shortcomings and wounds that have caused them to disconnect from the self, they disconnect from their emotions, they disconnect from being able to take any kind of constructive steps to heal this and move forward. But the only way we can move past this is by doing something different, learning to be honest, open, transparent, trust yourself, heal, get in these spaces where other men can help you heal, facilitate the healing, inspire you and call you forward to be your best. They let go of this idea of who you think you should be and how you think you should show up in your masculinity. Um, and they find healthier ways to display aspects of your emotions, to communicate, to be more in touch with your own inner being. And I think, like I touched on this earlier, being aware of how you got from point A to point B is important in all therapeutic journeys. But I think for men, you know, when you look at that inherited template of how you see men and how you see your world, it'll start to make complete sense. You'll look at the role models that you had growing up. You'll look at the influences and aspects of how men see themselves in the world, and then look at your own relationship with your father, and then think about that. Think about what shaped him. You know, what wounds did he go through in his family? You know, what dreams died within him that he didn't realize as part of his own responsibilities. You know, there's grief. There is very, very palpable grief there that has to be processed. Grieving the relationship that you probably didn't have. And that is one of the big things. What's not transformed is transferred. And as a man, if you're going to have a family, if you're going to step on that role, you need to take ownership of your own stuff. You need to decide that cycle stops with you. You need to look at what you haven't integrated and choose to integrate it to break that cycle in the line. Because look, in the past, maybe generations before, you didn't have the freedom or the availability or the resources to be able to do this work. But in this day and age, you can. And I wrote this too. This was so bang on. Jung believes that the greatest wound a child can bear is the unloved life of the parent. So every son needs to observe the wounds of the father to reflect if this has been passed forwards to him. So what were your father's wounds? Were there any sacrifices that he made, you know, for you, for others in the family? Are you aware of what his hopes and dreams were? Did he ever realize his dreams? Did he have permission to live life his way? What did he receive from his own father and culture that maybe hindered him in his own journey through life? These are all big fucking tangible questions, but they're never likely to be discussed. You're never likely to sit down and be like, oh, I must ask me that. You know, what dreams died with you? That you know, how did culture stop you from living life your way? But on a deeper level, what would you like to know about him as a man? About his life, his experiences, what he could have taught you about being a man if he had shared his experiences, or if you had allowed yourself to connect on that way. What was his unloved life, and is there any element that you're living out for him, whether consciously or unconsciously? And when you reflect on this, you can allow yourself to begin to understand your own father better, but not from a place of judgment, but to be able to be a better father to yourself, to reparent yourself in that way. So what you don't know can't hurt you, but also what you don't know controls you. And this, like, I remember the first time I read this, gave me goosebumps. There's no prison so confining as those of which you're unaware. And that is one of the most important things I think I would say within this is we all have blind spots. We all have stuff that holds us back. We all have wounds and triggers and different unconscious complexes that can show up in our life, can show up in our relationships, can show up in so many different ways that hold us back. And we mightn't even be aware that they're there. We know that something's not right, but we might not be aware of why. And I think that's one of the biggest things is to take that choice, to decide to heal, to work through stuff. And like first and foremost, that means being honest with yourself, owning your experience, owning your story, recognizing what's working from what's not working, you know, owning your story, talking through everything, I suppose, in a safe therapeutic space. I think even within these men's containers can be very, very helpful because you feel seen, you feel understood, you feel heard, you feel there's a level of trust there and respect there when these containers are done safely. And you can see elements of yourself in other people. You can see elements of your own struggles in other men. And part of this as well within choosing to do the healing is that you can learn to be more congruent, more yourself, and let that be seen without any kind of degree of fear or shame or judgment about who you are, to take complete ownership of your life and to live more authentically in that way going forward. And this leads me to the final point, and I think this is so important. I've said this about men physically fucking needing other men, because we talked about male loneliness, we talked about male mental health issues, you know, in terms of suicide. There's loads of other things I could talk about that are difficult and how that's centered around men. And the point is, this isn't to create a whole like divisionary based conversation around who has it harder, men or women. We've all got fucking challenges in life. We've got certain cards stacked against us in culture and society from a gender perspective. Whether we fucking like it or not, we do. Women have it fucking hard, men have it hard. They have it hard in slightly different ways, and there's areas where this intersects and overlaps for definite 100 million%. But elements of the male psyche and male conditioning and aspects of how men go about getting support is not fucking working, and this is why this needs to be looked at. I think men need other men because it helps them feel understood. It helps them see themselves in another person. You know, the struggles. It helps them to learn to let their guard down, which amongst men is a fucking massive tall order. And I think also men can relate much more tangibly from the premise of they've also been through it as a man. And it's like I'll never have any experience of what it's like to be a woman. You know, all the fucking problems that comes within that, you know, from age and certain seasons in life. And it'll be the same for men. There will be certain elements of life that men are going to be able to relate to much better because they themselves have experienced it. And that's, I think men need to allow themselves support from other men. A lot of men quit after one session within therapy. And I remember reading something before that a lot of suicidal men have reached out for support up to 4 times within professional services before they take their own lives, and it's not doing it. You know, something has to change. You know, we need to recognize that men don't like being psychologically dependent or dependent on females as it is, and yet we're in a heavily female dominated profession, and that is not a criticism or a judgment on the profession or on women for that matter. I think there's some fucking amazing, phenomenal female practitioners. All the best teachers I've had have been female, transformed my life. However, I do think for some men there is a psychological barrier to them letting their guard down with women, and I feel like men need to recognize they don't need to stay isolated in their pain, and it's not up to their partners, it's not up to the females in their lives to do the work for them. They have to choose to take on the task. They have to choose to break this cycle. Um, and it's only when they begin to acknowledge and own what's happened, talk about it, feel it, integrate it, that this cycle can become broken. Um, Having men been through that journey, having men share how they turned it around, you know, stepping on that role of being a mentor, holding that space for men who are still lost in the dark, that don't know their way out, that are stuck repeating cycles, that they hold up the mirror and be like, look, you're fucking up. This is the way this is going to change. This is how I help this change. How are you still in this cycle? You know, what support do you need in order to change it? To call forward the best within them is going to be a massive, massive help within that. And I think a lot of men are afraid of it. I think a lot of men are afraid of the responsibility. I think a lot of men would rather take the easy way out. They would rather the instant gratification of saying, like, that's just a load of balls. That's just for fannies or feminine women or whatever the fuck they want to say. But look, you'll see it in your relationships. You'll see it in your life. You'll see it in your mental health. You'll see it in the level of connection that you have in yourself and your family with your partner. And the thing is, like, it could be so much better than what it already is. You don't need to be afraid of your pain. And the major challenge we have is we need to create these strong, reliable, responsible, embodied, masculine elder men that are going to help initiate the younger generations coming through. Because if that doesn't happen, what the fuck? We're just going to repeat the cycle. Who's going to be the next teachers, the next healers, the next mentors, the next whatever? Men need to decide to do this for each other. You know, we don't need to be alone in our hurt and our pain and our experiences. We need to learn to lift each other up, to support each other. And look, women have been doing this so much better than men for so long. And the thing is, it needs to change. That's the only way that this cycle is going to be broken, even in families. So the fathers aren't carrying it forward through to their sons and so on. And that in itself is enough of a reason for it to happen. So I wanted to share that because I had recorded this in the past. It took a lot longer within the actual episode, but the audio file got so badly fucked up I couldn't use it. If you've any thoughts on this, just share them with me. DM me, message me on social media. If you know anybody that this might help, send it on them. Any fellas in your life, with your brother, your father, you know, could start rhyming off a whole load of stuff, your partner. Let them listen to it, see if it's valid and see if it makes any sense to them. I could have expanded on a load of these topics, and to be perfectly honest, this is topics that I've just made notes on from a few books that I was reading. And I've been diving into a lot of Jungian stuff. I've been looking at the shadow. I've been looking at a few other things, but I've also been applying this and reflecting this on my own life. And I ask myself these questions as well. You know, how can I embody the change that I'm talking about? Because I work primarily with women. I work with a lot of women. I never set out just to solely work with women. I've been very privileged to only have a handful of male clients, and I loved working with them. And there is a different approach to how I would work with men in some scenarios. But I think something needs to change energetically. And I think even speaking about these topics, what's different within the male psyche, what's different within that concept of how they cope, the way in which they're wounded, what's missing, what's absent. And if you don't choose to do the healing, if you don't choose to unpack what was missing in your life, if you don't choose to unpack what needs to be integrated, you're going to repeat a load of unconscious patterns over and over and over again. And especially where I see this is partner selection, attachments. That Muller complex is ever present. There's a Fowler complex there as well. It can show up in a different way. But the thing is, unconscious templates are constantly playing out through relationships, because all relationships, whether we like it or not, start with an element of projection and transference. And this is where you need to know yourself. One of the best things you can ever undertake in your life is really intimately learning who you are, what you're about, how you came to be this way. And look, the family therapy stuff that I went through myself and I've learned and I teach and I use with clients, that was fucking mind-blowingly transformative when I came across it at that stage in my life. And it was one of the only times I'd really sat down to look at, who am I? What kind of system did it come out of? What kind of system did my parents come out of? And I think that even in itself, for the average person, can completely change how you view things, completely change the meaning you ascribe to how you've learned to be the way that you are. And I think even within the brain, I was talking to my partner about this the other day, the brain throughout your life, your brain is constantly taking in information. There's things that you hoped were going to happen, and then things that happen for good and for bad. And that creates predictions. It creates repetitive patterns and neural pathways in the brain around what they expect and what not they expect. But at a certain point in time, there is an element of that becomes faulty, that doesn't apply in all contexts, and elements of your behavior don't make sense until you're actually able to look at it and go, well, where did that prediction actually come to be? Oh, well, I remember this one time, I expected this thing from my mom and I got this completely different reaction, and boom, there was pain, and that went on up through the nervous system and the brain. Don't do that again. Don't expect that. And then maybe I had another 10 experiences throughout life in different scenarios. So now I've got this fear and these contexts around certain things, but the brain has created that prediction, but that may not actually make sense in an adult life or in an adult context, because you're a resilient, resourced, competent, confident individual. And the meaning may have made sense at that time, but it might not make sense anymore. And we have to unpack that. And that will only happen once you actually start to own your story, explore your history, explore your background. Then the behavior will make sense. Everything makes sense when it's viewed from the right perspective and context. And I think men need to be acutely aware of that. You can't just keep doing what you're doing and expect and change, because you're going to end up imposing yourself on people, causing more hurt, causing more pain, or directing that inwards and hurting yourself. And we need men, we need these in life and relationships to step up. But only you can choose to do it. Your partner can initiate you. Your partner can call that forward within you if you're not prepared to bring it forward in yourself. And that's why I think men's groups can be really powerful for that. So I'll leave it at that. Any thoughts, as I said, message me, share the podcast, DM me. If you liked it, please let me know. And if there's any other topics that you want to hear, please send me a wee message. What else is happening? In terms of things that are coming up, I'm launching a course very, very soon on breakups. If you're interested, send me a message. It's not solely going to be on breakups, but it's going to be recovering from relationships. So it doesn't matter if this has been a short-term relationship, a long-term relationship, any relationship that impacted your confidence, your self-esteem, your sense of self. If you're struggling to move on since that, if it's showing up in other relationships since your behavior, or if you've got fears around repeating patterns, anything at all, this is for you. I've got it. Like, I've got you on this. There's going to be a live element to this, so you'll be able to interact with me while the course is running. You'll be able to ask questions, you'll be able to relay it back to your circumstances. I'll be there. I'll be able to engage with you. And I'm very excited to get this going. I've put a lot of work on this, and I'm buzzing to be launching this. So if you're interested, or you know somebody that would be interested, please get them to get in touch with me. Keep an eye on my social media, because I'll be advertising it on my stories and stuff. And I just want to say thanks again for listening.